Okay, I'm very pleased to introduce Jeffrey Gould, the very accomplished James H. Rudy Professor of History from Indiana University. From 1995 to 2008, he was also the director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at Indiana University. He's written and co-authored a number of books. His most recent is To Rise in Darkness, Revolution, Repression, and Memory in El Salvador, 1920 to 1932. That was co-authored with Aldo Larilla. Previously, he also published To Lead as Equals, Rural Protest and Political Consciousness in Chinandega, Nicaragua, 1912 to 1979. El mito de Nicaragua mestiza y la resistencia indígena, To Die in This Way, Nicaraguan Indian Communities and the Myth of Mestizaje, 1880 to 1965. And he is also the co-author of the 20th Century, A Retrospective. So that'll give you a sense of how prolific he is. He's also the co-editor of Memorias de Mestizaje, la política cultural en América Central desde 1900. And that book derived from an NEH collaborative project that was co-directed with two colleagues. He also has an extensive career in documentary film. He co-directed and co-produced Scars of Memory, El Salvador, in 1932. His second documentary film, titled La Palabra en el Bosque, deals with Christian-based communities in Morazán, El Salvador, during the 1970s. And that one was nominated for Outstanding Documentary at the Queen's World Film Festival. He's currently working on another film and book about labor struggles in the shrimp port of El Salvador called Port Triumph. And last but not least, he has several awards that I want to share with you, fellowships. He was awarded the Guggenheim Fellowship in 2002, an incredibly prestigious fellowship. And he was also a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton University from 2012 to 2013. So I'm going to turn it over to Professor Gould, who's going to share a few comments about the film before we start the screening, and then there will be time for questions and discussion after the film.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the Latin American Studies Center and the Department of History for sponsoring this. Thank you for coming out. I was here in Berkeley in 2004 to present our first film, Cicatriz de la Memoria, Scars of Memory. And that was a very exciting experience for me. And it was also very gratifying to see the reception that that film got in El Salvador. And I have to say, it was about probably the single most important event in El Salvador's history, and there hadn't been a prior film. And thus, on its own, it provoked a tremendous amount of discussion and debate. And it was a result of that very wide viewing that I was persuaded to pursue a second documentary film project, the results of which you're about to see. I worked, my collaborator is Carlos Enriquez Gonzalez, known as Santiago. He had been director of Radio Venceremos in the mountains of Morazán during the Civil War. And so he persuaded me to go visit that area. Previously, I'd been working on the other side of, admittedly, a tiny country, but still it seemed far away. And it was kind of due to his familiarity with the area that we, kind of had immediate access to a number of people. And quite quickly, I found their stories to be compelling, inspiring. Partly, their attempts after being exposed to liberation theology to form the kind of communities you'll see. And to me, they're akin to what the historian Jay Winter has called minor utopias. In those minor utopian communities become a focus of the film. They don't last very long, but nonetheless, they're important both because I think they're intrinsically important, but also in terms of memory. It struck me as a critical area to try and interrogate the memory or lack thereof about the communities, because very quickly many of the people who got involved in the formation of these communities opted to join the guerrillas, what became the Frente Farabundo Martí para la Liberación Nacional, or the FMLN, now a political party in power. when they joined them, they tended, when the peasants joined the guerrilla movement, they tended to look on these communities as something from the kind of primitive past, something that really lacked a great deal of importance. So part of the film is attempting to kind of re-examine that. Perhaps within the film there are the too faint outlines of a counter-narrative to the official FMLN narrative. And that narrative emphasizes state repression during the 1970s and guerrilla heroism, of which there was an abundance of during the 12-year-long Civil War. But again, there's a certain tension in the memory of what's emphasized and what's not, and perhaps we can discuss that at the end. I also found particularly compelling the way people looked at the current moment. Most of the work on this film was done between 2007 and 2011. And in 2011, I met with kind of the 6 of the main protagonists of the film. And they talked for 2.5 hours. And I distilled that 2.5 hours down to about 4 minutes when they discussed the current situation. And to me, those 4 minutes, and perhaps I'm biased on this, they reveal something about the attempts to find a language to express the transformation since the 70s and 80s into how do you express the neoliberal reality in which they all live. In another way, we tried with this second film to improve on our first film. Both of them never got very much funding, and that shows. But one way in which we tried to improve it was to avoid the use of omniscient narration. To me, a potential realm of symbolic violence in that it creates both a sense of authorial superiority over the film's subjects and a false sense of the fixity of historical interpretation. So with La Palabra en el Bosque, we eventually arrived at a compromise of sorts where we worked with a school teacher who had been a former guerrilla, and after long discussions about the content of the narration, we ended up agreeing on it. Unfortunately, the person is kind of a remarkable individual, just passed away. And in passing, I'll also note that another individual who's in that group at the end was just killed by gangs while milking a cow, Nolvo. And in any event, the work with the narrator is not an ideal solution by any stretch of the imagination, because ultimately, we controlled the shots in terms of the, editing primarily. In the end, the documentary is something of a result of a series of compromises between historical analysis that informs the narration and the editing of the campesino testimonies and the imperative of trying to create an adequate cinematographic language. Just a final note on the relation between historical research and documentary filmmaking. I've spent much time doing these documentary film projects. As I mentioned, I'm embarked on a third one now, primarily out of a sense of commitment to make our research available to those people who participate in the projects and their communities. Moreover, as many scholars have pointed out, the reverberations between past and present form a subject of intrinsic interest and importance. The documentary filmmaker is in an advantageous position to both study and highlight these reverberations. The film emphasizes the utopian aspects of the Christian-based communities, their highly developed communitarian and egalitarian qualities, more than it does the heroism of the guerrillas. In so doing, it suggests that those roots are perhaps most compelling today in a world where utopian thought and deep collective experiences have been relegated to a dustbin-marked archaic. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the film. Okay. So I have to make one comment. This is the first time I've seen the film a lot. This is the first time I've seen it since Nolvo, the person at the end, when he says, "Now we can die in peace." Unfortunately, a few weeks ago, he didn't die in peace. He was milking a cow and he was gunned down by Mara's gang members. So it's kind of a sad commentary on the situation. But on that happy note, I'd be happy to take any questions. Yes?
I was surprised by how open these individuals were in contributing to this project, and I was hoping you could talk to us a little bit about that, and whether these dialogues are still very much in the woods, or if they're more out in the open.
They're very much out in the open. There was a really very sharp contrast between my first project in El Salvador, which had to deal with the 1932 massacre that I started in 1998, just 6 years after the peace accords. And that was in Western Salvador. And there it was very different, very difficult to get people to talk about the elderly people to talk about that massacre. There were still kind of lingering effects 60 years after it. Whereas here it was quite different, partly probably because most people had been participants in a movement that didn't end up getting defeated. So I think that had something to do with it. What was hard to find were people who were opposed to the movement and who lived in the area in the 1970s, because around 1980, virtually all people who were opposed to the movement left the area, and most of them, hardly any of them returned after the war. They found other places to be, whether within El Salvador or outside of the country. And so it's really, there was only one person that we were able to find who actually had experienced all of this, but looked at it from the other side, as it were. And then just to finish up on that point, it was only a slight hint, but they were driven out in 1980, the people who were opposed to it. I mean, they had belonged to these right-wing paramilitary groups, and the local answer was to threaten them, and then if they didn't leave, they killed them. Yeah.
Yeah, I've gotten a little bit of trouble for saying that the U.S. is complicit in all this violence and murder.
Do you mean what's going on now?
No, in Central America and in South America in the past, mainly because of the School of the Americas. School of the Americas, who's trained in Fort Benning, Georgia, and still going on, trains all the militaries of El Salvador, Guatemala, different South American countries, and pays them. And then they're under the influence of the CIA, and you pointed out that Reagan support, Reagan's support actually caused a lot of the unnecessary violence. But in other words, it's like we're involved to prevent, anytime there's a challenge to authority or a challenge to a repressive system, people are called communist. It's been going on for decades. And it's just that, in other words, when we train the military and they become killers of their people, and we pay them, aren't we complicit in murder? Also, I heard that in El Salvador, it said 75,000 people. I heard about twice as many people were murdered. And in Guatemala, I think it was something like over 100,000 people as well. So it goes on and on again. We're always trying, you know what it is? It's all about protecting the capitalist, protecting the 1%. The 1% causes all this because they're afraid of true democracy.
Okay.
You got anything to say about that?
I mean, by and large, I agree with you. I mean, there's more. I mean, I think there's not much doubt that if the United States hadn't intervened, the guerrilla movement would have won in the early 1980s. But that's not to say that there wasn't a large chunk of the Salvadoran people who would have been opposed to them. I mean, it's hard to measure. But even in this particular area, it's not clear in the film, but at most 1/3 of the people were active in these communities. Probably another third opposed and another third neutral. So it's not, you know, what's more black and white, but even that's not black and white, is the level of repression and the kinds of repression that the military, which largely was backed by the United States, although Carter did briefly withdraw aid, that's true. On the other hand, not to make it an equivalent at all, the guerrillas in their earliest stages also engaged in kidnappings and things like that, so they certainly weren't.
Duarte, where was he from? Duarte?
Duarte?
Yeah.
Well, he was a Christian democratic leader of El Salvador.
El Salvador.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he had death squads. He was a terrorist. I mean,
well, I'm not sure. I don't think he himself, he presided over a government in which death squads operated. But he himself, perhaps he didn't do enough to try and rein them in, but he himself wasn't ordering them around. The opposition to the guerrillas included people of different political tendencies, both in the center and on the right. And it was very clearly the far right which was engaged in that. Now, the U.S., again, is broadly complicit because they were aware of what was going on and still continued to back the government. But that doesn't mean that the CIA knowledge of who was doing what, that didn't mean that they were necessarily calling the shots, nor did they necessarily think it was a good idea, although that is more disputable. Yeah?
Yeah, just moving more to the present. So, of course, one of the things is that the FMLN achieved, as a political party, achieved power in 2009. But maybe this was just me reading into it. It seemed that there was a sense of disillusionment among them as to the national. So, what relationship, if any, do these people who fought in the 1980s and 1990s? What relationship, if any, do they have to the central government or to the FMLN government? I don't know if that was something that came up during the filming, or if it's something that you can tell us a bit more about.
Well, I mean, in a certain sense, these people aren't representative because the one guerrilla group to which they belong, because the FMLN was, came out of 5 different groups, and the one group that they belonged to, the leadership pretty much broke with the FMLN, and then kind of the main leader, Joaquin Villalobos, left the country, and so they were pretty much abandoned. And there was a certain degree of suspicion with the rest of the FMLN. So in that sense, I think they're not exactly typical. My sense is that, they voted in the elections for the FMLN, but you're right, they're very disillusioned. Yeah.
I found it really interesting how there were like 2 reactions to the conditions of the government in the 70s. You had your one group that was just trying to be, who used Christian doctrine to sort of try to create their own utopia, to create their own, micro-governments, to try to at least live within the favors of the jurisdiction of El Salvador. But then you have the other group who just thought we should just uproot the whole system to begin with. Like, why are you trying to live within this system? Just begin with. So, I don't know. I just find it, even like today, the lack of political unity, as they were saying, the lack of political consciousness and unity and solidarity has really, it was civil war for a reason. So, I don't know. I don't know how, like in the political talks I hear from my family over there, how would they be able to even move on?
How would they what, sorry?
To be able to like move on and create this sort of unity, you get me? Even if it's a majority, of the Democratic role, like what is dividing people so much that they can't at least come with a basic, I guess, list of rhetoric, that everyone can stand behind? What's causing that division to just stay there?
Well, that's a very tough question. I think now the problems have just multiplied because of the prevalence of gangs in certain areas, and that's a whole separate discussion. But the government, the current FMLN-led government, doesn't seem to have much of a solution. And part of it is, I mean, I guess I would have hoped that after 12 years of civil war, they would have learned something about counterinsurgency. In other words, what did the U.S. and the Salvadoran government do to stop them? And that maybe they could have learned from that, but apparently not. And the other thing is the hostilities. You're right. There's a right-wing party that seems to behave kind of like the Republican Party does here, if I'm not offending anybody, and that you know, basically wants to sabotage everything, and so that doesn't help matters either. Yeah.
So I know you mentioned how one of the comments was that they don't have to be represented in the political scene anymore, but considering how Funes took the initiative to apologize about many of the massacres that took place in the Civil War. Does Morazán kind of remain an important political actor in today's elections and the election that just took place? Does the right seek to try to sway them into their political agenda, knowing how much international attention they've garnered in the past and today?
I think in the last presidential elections, at least the North, Morazán's pretty much divided between North and South, but if you just focus on the North typically votes in the national elections for the FMLN. But you know, a lot of people move there. I mean, when I made the point before that I couldn't find people who had experienced the 1970s, but after, you know, a lot of other people moved to the area, and many of them support the right-wing party. So it's hard to say, and not a lot has been. You know, the area is still pretty, relatively speaking, fairly marginalized in terms of the rest of the country. Back in the 60s and 70s, it used to be referred to as the Siberia of El Salvador. Yes?
Oh, so you mentioned gangs.
Yeah.
The person who was assassinated by them.
Yeah.
What drives the gangs economically down there? Like milk or something?
No, I mean,
Actually,
you know,
what I wanted to ask was, are the gangs superseding the military in violence now, or what's going on with that?
Well, I think by and large, since 1992, unlike in Guatemala, the Salvadoran military kind of retreated to its bases and really hasn't been involved in any kind of political repression. Really, there is no longer any political repression in El Salvador since 1992. I mean, there may be isolated instances, particularly some environmental activists were killed, but it's unclear. You know, it's not exactly clear what was going on there, whether it was the company who hired a couple of local thugs or not. But in terms of the government per se or the military per se, they're not really involved in that. Now, the FMLN, perhaps ironically, has called out the military to participate in trying to deal with the gang issue. And the gang's attitude is pretty much to directly confront the police and the military violently. And so, I don't know, the last time I was down there not too long ago, there was a policewoman walking into a little store to buy milk, and somebody came up to her and shot her in the head because she belonged to the police.
So what drives the gangs economically?
Well, they're maybe peripherally involved in the drug trade, but primarily they control areas and they practice extortion of small business people. That's pretty much it. Yeah. Hi. Yeah.
I guess watching a movie, like, we could see how the church, or at least Christianity or Catholicism, like, always worked as like a double-edged sword. Where one, you could see the Christian values from the far right, whereas liberation theology worked as like the counter for that. But I think what was really interesting at the end was what the lady said about having a new form, of Christianity. I think it was something like that, something along those lines. But I was wondering if you managed to like get an insight as to what was the role of the church or religion
today?
Yeah, today, based on what that happened that ever since 1992. Like, I feel
Yeah.
like like it was more special than just liberation theology, I felt.
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, a couple of those women, one of them, the Gabriela, unfortunately passed away recently as well. They're still active in that area. And when we first showed this film in the UCA, in the Universidad Centroamericana, which is the Catholic University in San Salvador, there were, you know, hundreds of people, or, you know, at least a couple hundred people who were from the Christian-based communities in the surrounding area. So they still exist. But unlike during the time of Monsignor Romero, there's no one really, as far as I can tell, in the church hierarchy who supports them. Whereas at that time, the church was split. And the group with Monsignor Romero actively supported, gave them protection, basically, to these Christian-based communities and to the popular organizations, the sort of peasant and labor organizations to which almost all of them belonged. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. For many years, at certain times I visited, you know, alternative communities, even hippie communes, and you know, Amish people who share everything. They share the wealth, and there's much more of a sense of equality. And what does it say when, in the beginning of the film, you know, the people collectively working together, sharing the wealth? I mean, sometimes that awful word communism or even socialism is really about sharing the wealth. What does it say that they want to destroy that?
Well, I mean, I think there's a curious dynamic which isn't really clear in the film. It's mentioned when I talked about a counter-narrative at the beginning. This is what I was referring to, is that the communities actually weren't repressed until later on, at the very early stages. But there was a difference. I mean, I don't want to get into all the details of it, but there was a difference that people began to feel, people who were involved in the communities began to feel that their neighbors and other people and the local authorities were all hostile. You know, it's not like they were getting thrown in jail at that time. But when they opted to start joining the guerrillas, the communities per se hadn't suffered that. But what they felt was actually this kind of linguistic transition from community to communism. So when they kept on talking about communities, and other people started conflating community with communism. And so that's how it began, that, you know, locally they started being referred to as communists, and that brought a great deal of fear. They felt a great deal of fear, and then that kind of pushed them into the guerrilla option, because they figured, you know, sooner or later they were going to get gunned down.
Do you think Bernie Sanders is dispelling some of the fear of communism and socialism?
I don't know, we'll see.
Are there any other questions? Okay, in that case, I would like to thank Professor Gould for being with us here today, and for to all of you for coming out.
Thank you.